This session is supposed to be about these white people sitting in our country and telling us about us. So what I thought we should do is just jump right into this conversation, catch the minority on this panel. It's not who you think it is. It's James Crabtree because he's the tallest guy, who's the only guy who's more than 6 feet 4 inches tall. And as a minority and a guy sitting in Singapore, having spent a lot of time in India sledging us and telling us how nasty a country we are, I just want to ask him, James, what is the value you bring to this world?
Very little. Can you hear me at the back? So yeah, when I told my agent I was going to try and write a book about India, he looked at me and said, do we really need another book about India by another white British journalist? And I guess it's a reasonable question to ask. Given we've got such a big panel, let me just say only two things to start. There is a sense that you get a lot on social media that Western journalists in particular kind of have it in for India. They're perceived to be critical of Mr. Modi. And I suppose my perception is the opposite, that when I talk to colleagues, I used to work for the Financial Times, around the rest of Asia, particularly in Eastern Asia and in China, the Western journalists here are really fantastically pro-India compared to those who have to work in much more repressive regimes, particularly China. And at least part of that is that there's a perception that it's quite hard to be a Western journalist here, and that people worry about whether the government might be cracking down on journalistic voices, but actually it's much easier to be a journalist in India than it is to be in most of the rest of Asia. You don't have to learn a prohibitively difficult foreign language. The society is fairly open. Indians like to talk. And so for people like me who tried to write a book, I got fantastic access when I was here. So in a sense, it's not so much what are we for, it's more that we should be grateful for the fact that this is such an easy country to operate in.
But what do you do, James?
Well, look, the classic answer is that we are interpreting the country for foreigners who either don't know very much about it or interpret it from certain perspectives. So you have to be good at picking and choosing. And I think there's something in that. Nonetheless, I think it's also true that compared to other countries that are more difficult to interpret, particularly linguistically, there is slightly less need for foreign correspondence here than there is in a country like China or Japan, which are simply less scrutable to outsiders.
Thanks, James. When we were growing up, how many of you remember a guy called Rakesh Sharma? Raise your hands. So there's this famous video clip of Rakesh Sharma. This guy is in space and Indira Gandhi is asking him a question. She says, "Upar se Bharat kaise dikhta hai aapko?" Then he says, "Sare jahan se acha Bharat, Hindustan hamara," right? And everybody clapped and we all shed tears and all that. So there's a similar situation here with my friend PK sitting to my left, who's sitting in Singapore and telling us how nice a country we are. Singapore, he goes from his house to his office in 20 minutes, no speed breakers, no potholes, there are street lights at night. And when I used to live there, I used to say that Singapore is the best country to live in India, right? Because you are just 4 hours away from every Indian city, and you get the best of Singapore urban infrastructure, shopping, and weather, maybe not, but almost everything else. But then you get to look at India and tell us how good we are. So, PK, why are you so positive about India? Is it nationalism or is it objective?
You think I'm positive about India? Yeah, I am most of the time. My job is to interpret India to foreign investors, and two types of foreign investors. Most of the time it is foreign institutional investors. When I started my career, I used to interpret India for foreign direct investors. And most of them, at least in the beginning, were extremely negative about India. They had all kinds of stereotypes that were quite negative. I think I took it upon myself to be the contrarian. And I think there's a lot to be positive about India. We are, of course, the world's fastest growing economy by a long way now. We have the prospect, I think, of the next 10 years of doing even better, a lot better, as long as the election goes the right way.
The right way?
Yeah. Nobody said anything to that, but anyway.
But tell me this, is it easier to be bullish about India sitting in Singapore?
It is relatively so. Well, when we started, I suppose when I first got to Singapore, it was quite difficult because the Singapore newspapers used to cover India as if it is it's the exact example of everything that's wrong with democracy, and so they loved to talk about all that was bad, and there were lots of former Indian journalists working for the Straits Times who were part of that story. As
We have common friends.
Yeah, we have some fairly common friends who were part of that cabal. So so getting the story about India out was quite difficult, and so in fact, among other things, we set up an India club to
Change the narrative about
to
India.
change the narrative, to put out the positive story about India. And in fact, we used to invite some of the great and the good of India. Ram Guha, we almost invited once, but we couldn't pay his fee. It was a but we got Amartya Sen, of the left. We had Arjun Singh of the left. So, sometimes even the left has reasonable ideas, and we're happy to entertain them.
Okay. Thanks, Vijay. I'm going to focus on, take the thing to Alyssa. Alyssa is a good friend, so I won't be very harsh with her. But I still have to ask her this question. There are a lot of think tanks in India. There's a lot of, as James said, everybody in India writes about India in English. So if a person in Washington, D.C. wants to know what's happening in India, who's going to win the next election, all of that is plainly visible, and it's, it's not like China that you have to translate and you're going to look for some secret website and then translate it into English and so on and so forth. So what does an analyst like you bring to the table? I mean, for the Americans and for India. I mean, why you?
So I knew he was going to ask me this question. Is this on?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, now we're good. Nitin told me he was going to ask me this question. What is the value that I bring? And I think it really is an issue of audience. I am not writing for an American audience to sort of interpret the events that happened 4 hours ago. Instead, I write for an American audience that might be interested in foreign policy generally, but is likely not to be following India closely. And so my angle is, what are the American national interests, and what should the United States be thinking about in our relationship with India? So the book that I just published this year is really focused on the fact of India's rise to power on the world stage, providing a backdrop for that story of India's rise, what India's interests are, and how the United States should be thinking about our relationship with India. And that, I think, is a perspective that I bring to this. As a former U.S. policymaker, I served in the State Department in the Obama administration, and I don't think that's a perspective that somebody here who hasn't served in U.S. government and is not thinking about U.S. interests would be able to bring to the table. So that's my kind of unique lens on this.
But would you, in your interpretation of events in India, would you put the interests of the United States or the current administration up front, or would you be playing more of the role of a bridge, like what PK is trying to do? We are trying to bridge two cultures, two countries, two economies, two businesses. Where would you stand on that?
I am probably much more on the side of U.S. interests, what those are, and my recommendations on how the United States should pursue different aspects of our ties with India.
Yeah, I asked you that question because I knew the answer, and you're quite unambiguous in doing that. Because I think a lot of what I've seen is that when these kind of comments come out, analyses come out, you just don't quite know where the analyst stands, right? The analyst could be positioning himself or herself as a bridge, but actually batting for the US.
You know where I stand.
That's why I asked you that question, and you honestly answered it. Thank you for that. Max, you were in Cairo, right? Before India. So, did you get questions like this asked in Cairo? Like, why are you in Cairo? What are you telling us about us that we don't know?
Yes, yeah, but not quite so.
This mic?
My mic is not working?
Yeah, it is. You just have to pull it up.
Okay. Yeah, but not with quite the intensity of India, because I think the thing about India is that India is immensely it's immensely covered by journalism. I mean, there's such a, I don't think there's any other country in the world that has so many journalists and has so many outlets. And the case is rather different in a place like Egypt. And I think the other thing is that, I spent much of my journalistic career in the Middle East, where the press is under considerable pressure. And so people do rely to a larger extent on what the outside world says, because they need to, because very often that's where the reality, the truth comes from. Whereas I don't think that's so much true of India. I mean, a lot of people may find it odd for me to say this. Indians might find it strange for me to say this, but one of my first impressions when I arrived in India was, gosh, this is wonderful. It's such an open society. There's such a free press. It's so easy, as James was saying, to have access to everything. I thought that was great, and so I think the contrast is kind of important. I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, in terms of first impressions, I was talking to a colleague from The Economist just yesterday, who's just arrived in India recently, but he's been spending all his time in Africa. And again, Indians might find it amusing, perplexing to know that his first impression of India was, gosh, how efficient, how modern, how progressive, how everything works. You can order anything on Amazon. This is fantastic, So, these different perspectives do change. And now I've been in India now for 3 years, and so it's been a very steep sort of trajectory from a state of catastrophic and absolute ignorance, being amazingly stupid about everything, to feeling only mildly stupid, like your uncle who sort of drools and slurps his soup and so on. I'm just embarrassingly stupid about things Indian, compared to the vast knowledge that you have here. I mean, there's just so much talent already out there. So I feel actually very humble to be in a place like India and actually to reporting on India. It's such an immense subject. We only play a very small part, and I'm always immensely impressed by the talent of people who are doing my job here.
Thanks, Max. Alex, you sell us the most expensive magazine that you can buy. It's like 150 years ago, they took away the Kohinoor, and now they're taking away our money because they're selling us an expensive magazine. I just paid 10,000 rupees for an annual subscription of this magazine, right? My first subscription in India was about 7,000. First of all, you guys are expensive, right? I hope it shows up in your paycheck as well. But here's the thing. The Economist has been found guilty of being extremely hostile to Indian popular opinion, to the extent that a minister said, how many votes does The Economist have? Right? When you came out with the endorsement of, when you endorsed a prime ministerial candidate in the last election, which was not the guy who actually won the election. Yeah. The guys who won the election asked, how many votes do you have, right? So it's like, how many divisions does the poll? So the question is, why do you think that you guys have the right to tell us whom we should elect as a prime minister?
Right. Okay.
That's only second in importance to the fact that why is your magazine so expensive?
Okay. We wish it were not so expensive. We have contracts with advertisers worldwide that make it difficult to play to one market or another. But the harder question is...
Can I help with that? It's worth the price.
Too much.
To the people who
Everything
pay.
PK said in that case.
Okay.
The question you pose about why The Economist feels entitled to weigh in about which way the public should vote in any given election is a question that we can be and are asked by every country in the world. Every country that's got an election big enough for us to pay notice to it, including the Philippines or Brazil or the United States. The force with which it's asked tends to have a lot to do with the degree of sensitivity that the given country, or the party at least, that feels insulted by our judgment tends to feel at our having this judgment to offer for free to our Indian readers. We don't have many votes in India, but if anyone wants to take our advice, all you have to pay is an extremely expensive subscription, or read us for free bit by bit online. The one thing I would say a little bit more seriously about this country, which does have such an enormous and free or even inexpensive press to compete with what we have to offer, is something that should not be the case. The press is free here. Unlike in China, foreign correspondents don't get kicked out for saying things that are unfriendly to the central government. And if we never mind cases of criminal defamation or the occasional assassination, which tends to afflict only Indian journalists working usually on local or regional outlets, you can say what you want to. Why indeed should any Indian reader be paying attention to what the outsider has to write? We're generally less informed. We have to work a lot harder and with often fewer resources to get close to the facts at hand when we're talking about an Indian story that might be covered as well by the Indian press. But one thing that is the case today is that has been forever, but I feel it's become especially the case in the past few years, is that Indian media outlets face immense indirect pressure from the government, from the central government, other governments as well, that cannot be applied so easily to foreign outlets.
Really?
Not so easily, in the sense that foreign outlets are not owned by important business concerns in India. I mean, you talk, I'm sure, to plenty of Indian journalists and editors who know how easy it is to attract an angry phone call from a government office. And if the phone call isn't directly threatening to the freedom of the publisher, it's very often directly threatening to the commercial interests of the owner. And this is a way of manipulating press coverage that's become stronger and stronger, and I think ought to at least make those of us with foreign ownership more and more able to offer something new, something outside, a less distorted perspective. It's striking that in recent years, it's new and online portals that have offered a lot of the most critical and often most muckraking stories. These are publications, I'm thinking of Scroll or Wire, Alt News, that don't have large corporate ownerships that can be manipulated by phone calls that we as journalists never see. It's, of course, I don't want any of this to change. It suits the foreign journalist very well right now to have this privileged position. But I think it's one of the reasons also that our readers do value us a bit more than they might if things were better.
Okay, taking up from something which PK said, those of us who remember international coverage of India in the 90s, especially in the 90s, remember a time when India usually used to be in the dock, right? It's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The West is telling us to sign it. CTBT, the West is telling us to sign it, and we say we're not going to sign it, right? Then the nuclear explosion happens, and you guys are in the doghouse, and everybody's saying that you guys are in the doghouse and you belong there. So there was a lot of antagonism, and then there's this question of getting into the WTO, conversations around the trade deals. So the country felt itself on the defensive, and the coverage in the Western press about the country tended to be a lot more critical or almost pointing fingers kind of thing, and which seems to have changed in the last few years. Do you think it's changed? Straits Times as a starting point, and then other things?
Well, I mean, it depends who you're thinking about and talking about. But the Financial Times, for instance, I think is relatively impartial. The Economist, largely so. The old British, the British fight back is basically those two. But I think what is striking about the coverage of the economies, let's just focus on the economies. I recall that the time that there were a couple of quarters in the early 2000s when India started growing faster than China. And it did not make the front page of the Financial Times. It didn't even, actually, I don't, the actual news item did not make it to the front pages at all. And in general, the red in the Economist sometimes, to me, in the past particularly, not so much this year, but in the past, has often represented the red of Red China, because the coverage of China in the Economist
is fawning.
always.
We did have a cover of the
Now,
tiger.
this year has been different. I mean, suddenly this year, the Economist has woken up to the fact that the West got China wrong for 25 years. I'd say it was almost self-exculpatory. I mean, it was kind of it was the Economists more or less saying, yeah, maybe we got China wrong for 25 years, couched in the language of the West. And I think the Economist is the best representative of Western opinion, and so that's fine. The Time magazine is a poor shadow of what it was. So that is one aspect. And given the fact, the way I look at my role in the markets, I mean, this is, since Nitin knows me rather well, he's let out a secret that I hope there aren't too many foreign institutional investors here. I do tend to take a positive view of India a little bit more than normal, partly because the bad news about India, whatever it is, whether it's the Congress in power, the BJP in power, the bad news gets out first because we are a democracy, and the bad news is always out there. The bad news out of China is buried. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that if you look at coverage in the financial press.
You just said that. You just said they sort of have it in for India for structural reasons, too easy to get hold of information, or that foreign correspondents love to write about stories about animals. This is a sort of popular trope that we all come here and desperately try and write about elephants or snakes, and some of us do. It's a sort of rite of passage. But I think there's a sort of danger that the conversation about foreign correspondence is a little bit old-fashioned. So you begin with the sort of fountainhead of Mark Tully, and you have this sort of Anglo-spheric model of what the foreign correspondent is. And this panel, I have to say, is not doing a great job of dissuading that. But India is heading into a much more complicated world, whereas instead of just thinking about the FT and the Economist and the New York Times, now all countries are going to have to consider, what does the Chinese press say about India? What does the Russian press say about India? What does the press in the immediate neighborhood? That as the power of the West collectively, and particularly the Anglophone part of the West, gets lessened, then the sort of engagement you have to have with foreigners becomes much more, the foreign media becomes more diffuse and complicated. Now that's sad for some of us on this
James,
panel,
but look at us, we don't care. We only care for three types of countries. Countries that that speak English, countries that play cricket with us, and countries that create problems for us. The rest of them don't matter. I mean, who are these countries? Why do they matter? Why do
we're 3 for 3, so.
but Alyssa, I want to bring you here. Back to this business of narrative. Do you think in the US, the narrative among the US press and the Washington think tank community is far more positive about India today than it was, let's say, in the 90s? And what would you say is your role in shaping it either way?
I'd like to answer that from the perspective of foreign policy, because I am not a working journalist. I've never been a journalist, and so that just isn't the space that I have any professional focus on. But what I do think has changed over time, particularly since the year 2000 forward, has been the relationship between India and the United States and the level of visibility India has acquired in the United States. Having said that, it still is not center stage in a way that I would hope to be the case for a partner that should be among the most important partners for the United States. And that's actually something that I worry about a lot. In US foreign policy, there is a tendency to think of the world as Europe, Russia, the important economies of Asia, China, Japan, and then everything else is kind of in a basket of other. And it's very difficult to get these other issues on the stage, on the radar screen. So you'll have crises in the Middle East that will come up very regularly. I'm sure you're very familiar with all of this. And then that will attract a lot of attention for a while, but then you move on to the next crisis. And for India, as I've written in my book, part of the challenge is that it is neither a traditional U.S. ally, so we don't have decades of experience working very, very closely together with routine meetings happening all the time, nor is India a crisis where you've got a kind of sudden, urgent focus. India is not North Korea. India is not Syria. There's no crisis like that. So that is part of the challenge as I see it. How do you find and maintain attention to developments in this country a country that structurally is growing into a much larger role on the world stage and will continue to play an ever greater role on the world stage, but doesn't always get on the radar screen in such a way that you get your top policymakers focused and paying attention. So to me, I think that's the biggest challenge.
Thanks. So I'll just bring you guys into the conversation. Alex and Max need to get the first two questions. So we are open. Just ask your questions, and we'll try. We've got about 15 minutes of Q&A. Sir, you want to get a mic?
Someone's coming for you.
Or you can try shouting.
Hello?
Yeah.
For a very long time, we've had these false narratives pushed by the colonial period for going back 150 years. We talk about Aryan invasion theory, martial race theory. At what point do foreign journalists come clean and say, and we're pushing more theories like that now, like Hindu terror, and so it's always new tropes being pushed and making it look like it's a thing of the past. Sorry, and making it look like it's a thing of the past, but it's very prevalent even now, and it's being done through NGOs, the church, journalism.
Okay, so this is big British conspiracy against us, right? And Alex, you've got to answer. Is there a big British conspiracy against us with all of those things? And if so, what's your role in that?
Speaking as a ex-colonial American, Anglophobe more than Anglophile. Sorry, James. I just don't see it that way at all. I mean, the two of the three colonizers' ideas you pushed to me seem like established facts. Interesting and worth arguing about, maybe, but not something that I or my publication came with an agenda to promote. I mean, the Indo-European language thesis, which is in parts called the Aryan invasion, or Hindu terror, which seems like an arguable but perfectly factual way to describe some terrorist attacks in this country. I would like to retain the right to make what judgments I can, despite the national origin of my employer. But I have no better defense than that to offer.
It's more for the gentleman there, from the English perspective.
James?
Yeah.
The Brits. You think we have particular frames that are biased? I think Alex gave a very good. I mean, look, journalists have to frame issues in ways that appeal to their readers, and so that's the thing about the animals critique. The fact that lots of foreign journalists come over here and write about monkeys or dogs in Delhi or whatnot. There's an assumption that this will appeal to readers, and the difficult thing is that's actually true. Readers like these kind of stories. Readers of the FT like stories about gold. If you write stories about gold, it shoots up to the top of the top 10 most read list. So I don't agree that there are particular sort of cultural tropes. Never in my time at the FT do I remember anyone writing about Aryan invasion theory. But there certainly are particular frames that foreign journalists use because they know that they will appeal to international readers. Now, sometimes you go with that and you run with it, and sometimes you have to kind of battle with your editors to move against it. So it's a sort of challenge of the job. India, you're more fortunate because people internationally simply know a little bit more about India than they do if you're writing about, I don't know, Malaysia. So you have more things to work with.
Okay, let's move on. Some other question?
To any of the foreign correspondents, do you feel Indians are hypersensitive to criticism compared to other countries?
You're calling us hypersensitive?
The journalists. I mean, yeah, I would like their view. What have they found? I'm not saying it is or it is not.
Max?
No, I think Indians are very much fall right in the middle, not more hypersensitive or less, but certainly are hypersensitive. But virtually any country that you go to has is sensitive to how the rest of the world sees it. I think, what's often also the case is that many people in particular countries, including in India, don't actually have a very good idea of how the rest of the world sees them. I mean, you make a lot of assumptions about how the rest of the world is seeing you, which are not necessarily true. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I was mentioning first impressions of people who come to India might see it as a very modern and progressive and sort of country. Whereas many Indians, I think, are under the impression that other countries, partly because of the way that India is portrayed in the press, might be rather backward, which I don't think is necessarily the case at all. So I think that sometimes Indians maybe should read more of the foreign press in order to see how they're actually viewed. Because I think there are a lot of false impressions. I mean, you mentioned false narratives. I think that is in some ways a false narrative too, is how Indians think that they're being observed by the rest of the world.
I think there's another thing which I just want to bring in. We were talking about it just before we walked in. I think a lot of us have blind spots about our own country. There are certain kinds of news items which we'd rather not talk about. And these guys don't have that blind spot. So in that sense, they perform some kind of a service, bringing out those things into the open. And we've got to deal with it. So that's what it is. Some other questions? Sir.
Yeah, hello. This question is for Alyssa.
Yeah.
Have you sent a copy of your book to President Trump?
I'm sorry, ma'am?
Have you given a
Have
copy
you
of your
sent
book
a
to
copy
President
of
Trump?
your book to President Trump?
I have not, ma'am. Thank you.
No, I have one other question. USA is interested only in selling military hardware and drones and other equipment. They are not really interested in improving the relationship with India. What is your opinion?
Well, I don't share that opinion. I believe the United States is interested and has been interested over the course of the last now 4 U.S. administrations in strengthening and deepening our ties with this country. The defense relationship is actually one of the great success stories of the last 15 years. I celebrate that. I think it's a wonderful thing that we are now working more closely together on defense and security issues than we ever have in the past. The procurement, you referred to selling defense equipment, that has actually evolved quite considerably. In 2012, during the Obama administration, we began a new chapter in thinking about how India and the United States would begin to both co-produce defense equipment together, and with eventually an eye towards co-developing new defense technologies. I think this is exciting and important stuff to be working on. There is, of course, a very strong interest in the United States in developing a better economic relationship. I will fully admit that we've got a lot of economic differences. Those have been magnified under the Trump administration because the president has some particular new areas of focus economically that we have not had in the past, like trade deficits, the new steel and aluminum tariffs. We didn't have these before. So on the economic side, there are, of course, frictions, but those have always been there. India is a sometimes challenging country to negotiate with economically. I think your negotiators in the trade world would probably be proud of that fact. But I don't think actually that the defense relationship is a problem. I think it's actually a real asset. I think it's a wonderful development.
So, the next question will be somewhere at the back, right? So,
yeah. This is to all of you. Between foreign investors and foreign correspondents, who's getting India right business and economics wise?
Alex, you've got it. Between investors and journalists, who's getting it right?
I'm not sure I understand. The investors on the one hand or the journalists on the other?
Yeah, foreign investors and foreign journalists. Who's getting India right?
Huh. Well, I have a stake in this matter.
Which is why I came to you.
Okay. I don't know. It would be churlish not to give it to the investors. After all, they have money on the table. We just need eyeballs. But I'm doing my very best. So are my journalist colleagues to get it right. PK, do you think we're winning?
But PK, I just want to change the question a little bit. Do you think the coverage which The Economist, FT and the others have an influence on how foreign investors look at India?
I think they do to some extent at least. And I think it's worth noting about The Economist is that most of their correspondents are actually American, so they're not British. It is not a neo-colonial enterprise as a result. And so I think The Economist generally gets India broadly right. They make, obviously they have a few judgments of error, but otherwise, errors of judgment rather, and otherwise they are generally quite good. With regard to investors, I think if you look at the record of investors in the equity markets in India, foreign investors have done very well. Those specializing in India have been among the best performers because the Indian market has done remarkably well over the last 20, 30 years. So I think investors are getting India right much of the time.
Investors have certainly
are a very
made a lot more
broad
money.
category. So you have specialist India investors, you have emerging market investors, you have broader investors who just take a small interest in India as part of a global portfolio. So it's difficult to say what the broader community is doing, but the India-focused investors have done really
Indians are not allowing the investors to go wrong. It's the other way. We are not allowing them to get it wrong. Yeah.
This year, slightly less.
Just from the perspective of Mahatma Gandhi or India as being the leader of the non-aligned movement or whatever it was, the disarmament story has died on the way. Every international meet between the heads of India and any other country, the leading ones, is always about that new weapon, this new weapon, that much more billions of dollars. We've got housing shortage, we've got roads, we got issues of public health, sanitation, hygiene. Why is those topics of common interest not the priority when it comes to the journalists and the correspondents' communication? Isn't India the leader of the world when it comes to disarmament? And if we have disarmament, if we have that much more of value and wealth coming into the economy, wouldn't it change the world? Are we not going more and more into the arms race once again?
See, between this, if there are this new weapon and that new weapon, I would want to have both. That's from my perspective. So I'm not the right guy to point this. Maybe it should be Alyssa. Alyssa, very quickly, is disarmament dead, or is India trying to push life into it?
India's position internationally has long been that the world should aim for total nuclear disarmament, but for practical purposes, until that can be accomplished, India wants to be able to protect it and defend itself. But let me just say, certainly as someone who has spent a lot of time in U.S. government bilateral meetings with Indian counterparts, we discuss the whole range of issues, whether it is economic development, whether it's shared collaborative development initiatives in third countries, whether it's thinking about the importance of women's empowerment, whether it's higher education and how we can advance those issues in both countries. So there's a huge range of topics that are covered in our bilateral relationship. I'm not sure why you're only focused on the defense aspects. Those are very, very important. But certainly when I was in government, we had something like 30 different dialogues going. A dialogue on consular issues. You wouldn't believe how complex consular issues and visas are. There's a lot to talk about.
May I just say also that there's a nice myth in India that we got our independence exclusively through non-violence. I've written a whole book trying to disprove it.
Is this Bengali thing with Bose and something?
It's in English, but it's not, it's not just Bose. It started with Tilak, Lokmanya Tilak, Sri Aurobindo, Bhaga Jyotin, the Gadar movement, Lala Hardayal. I think we need to know about this. A Rowlatt Act, what did you say?
He said Golwalkar.
Did I mention him? Do you know what Savarkar did? Have you heard of Madan Lal Dhingra? Have you heard of Madan Lal Dhingra? Do you know what Churchill said about Madan Lal Dhingra's definition of nationalism? See, I am not here to defend any particular perspective, but the point is that there was something called a Rowlatt Act after the First World War. On 20th of August 1917, Montagu, the Secretary of State, hinted that India was going to get dominion status after the war. Instead, we had the Rowlatt Act. The Rowlatt Act was not in response to some sort of non-violent action that Indians were taking. It was because the Gadar movement had put the fear of God into the Brits, and they came up with the Rowlatt Act instead of giving India dominion status in line with Montagu's suggestion. So, I would suggest that we need to relook at how we got our independence. If indeed the Quit India movement got us our independence, why was it that 500,000 Indians joined the British Indian Armed Forces between August and December 1942? Instead, think back to what happened with the INA trials. Think back to what happened immediately after the INA trials. In the Central Legislative Assembly election of 1945, the Congress brought a non-congressman to lead its campaign, a man called Sharad Bose. And in January, February 1946, the Royal Indian Air Force and the Royal Indian Navy mutinied, which is why
India got independent. I would want to call upon India's foremost.
Let us now begin to re-understand why. If we think that disarmament is India's contribution to the world, we are in trouble.
Okay, I just want to
disarmament is not the basis on which one can make foreign policy.
The world's foremost expert on the Rowlatt Act is in Bangalore, and he's sitting there. Ramgua, you want to make a simple comment on what's the role of? Get him a mic, please. Ram, you just have to answer whether armed struggle was important or not.
It's not a panel on this, it's a panel on foreign journalism. Let's get that. To follow up on.
Happy to have a debate.
This is not a panel on the history of nationalism, it's a panel on foreign journalism in India. And I'd like to take the question of disarmament in a different direction. It is a fact that the 5 largest suppliers of arms are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Right? Now, I think that's something on which everyone should reflect upon. That's all I'd say.
Okay, so that's a deflection. The last one, I'll just give it to the gentleman who was standing there. I think it's only fair that he takes the question. And we have all of 6 seconds to finish this point.
We'll just have a question.
Yeah, who do the foreign correspondents think will win in 2019?
All right. See, this is the question, right? How many votes do these guys have? 0, right? So they can.
We haven't decided yet.
It's a good one. Alyssa.
I'm not a journalist.
They're so skilled at ducking the question. Well, I would say I'll be more forthright, and I'll say that it is the current government's election to lose. That's what I think.
PK, not Modi?
Modi.
Alex?
Yeah, I won't disagree with Max, but wait and see who we endorse.
Thank you. On that wonderful note,